Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much and welcome to InspireOne's webinar on understanding your leaders better. Let me introduce you to today's speaker, Ms. Neeta Mohla, who is Director and heads the leadership practice at InspireOne. Neeta has 3 decades of experience, out of which almost 16 years has been in the area of people development and assessments. She is also certified by IBM on high performance behavior. Her deep understanding of behavioral competencies allows her to leverage various assessment tools for leadership development. She has worked across industries for Indian and global organizations. Also, today's webinar is being conducted by InspireOne. So let me speak a little bit about our organization. We are a leading consulting firm and we offer organizational leadership development solutions. We have nearly 2 decades of experience in the consulting domain and we help organizations convert their people and organizational capabilities into corporate value. Also, we have solutions in the area of leadership development, culture change, productivity excellence, customer centricity and performance and sales performance. We have global reach and delivery capabilities. So we have 3 global partners which are actually who help us and are part of our global and research know-how. They are IBM, TAC and TMI. We have worked across to 50 plus for clients, and the number of people that we have inspired have been around 1 lakh. So let me pass on the mic to now Ms. Neeta Mohla, and she'll take away the session for everybody now.
Thank you, Sumati, and good afternoon to everybody who's present. It's my privilege to be able to take you all through this presentation today, and I do hope that this will add value to something that you're interested in and I'm sure already know a lot more about. So I'm just going to start with stating what is the agenda for today. What we're going to talk about, of course, everybody knows that assessments is important, but I think it's even more important to understand why is it becoming so important and how is it that we can really leverage this particular data or information in our day-to-day work as well as in our strategic work. What we'll also talk about is that having understood that assessments is really critical and important, how do we go about it? What is the philosophy that we should follow? What is it that we should bear in mind so that when we are using assessment tools, we are able to use this very effectively? Then we will talk about how do we devise or design assessment strategies which are aligned to business goals. So that's the third objective for today, and finally the call for action. In this webinar, what we will do is I will be able to take you through the presentation in the first 40 minutes or so, and the last 10 minutes we will keep for interaction, for questions that may come up, and also ideas that may flow from you. So that's the flow of this session today, and I hope that through the interaction, through what we present, we'll be able to come up with something that you can go back and use and apply. So let me start about mentioning why is it so important, why are assessments so critical, why has it become even more critical in today's context, and also what are the new trends around it. So as we all know that predictive decision making is something that is becoming very critical, very important, as in business, so also of course in all HR processes. Every organization wants to ensure that taking from this prediction, how do we make sure that we have the best person possible for every job, and especially if the job is critical, especially if the job is a leadership role, it really has a lot of business involved in being able to make the right kind of decision. Therefore, organizations are becoming more and more interested in knowing, firstly, what are the best characteristics in their critical leaders so that they can leverage this very effectively. They're also interested in knowing that for a particular role, what are those characteristic fitments that become very, very important. And also, since each organization has its unique culture, what is the best fit that we can look at when we are looking at the fitment of a person in the context of a culture of an organization. And what we do know from research now is that when these three aspects come together, we can comfortably feel and be at ease that we are setting the way and the path for high performance. Let me take an example. And here I want to sort of take our own experiences and quote those so that they're actually real life stories. So there is an organization that we are working with currently where a CEO has been placed in a new in an organization which is really in the infant stage of its evolution. The CEO is very talented. The CEO has a lot of experience. The CEO has a lot of relevant experience, a lot of competencies, a lot of skill, a lot of knowledge. But the company in the last 1 or 2 years, ever since its inception, hasn't been performing very well. And when we've looked at the reasons for this, one of the issues that is coming up is the fact that the CEO, although is really fit for this role, although is very culturally aligned to this role, but when we go down to career motivators, what you really require in this context is a person who's an innovator, who can start off a greenfield activity and really take it to its next stage of evolution. But the career motivators of this CEO are not aligned. The CEO is more inclined towards working in large organizations where processes are pretty much in existence, in shape, and being able to take the organization, which is a little bit more mature, to its next stage of evolution. So really making sure, now there's nothing wrong with the CEO. We can't say that the CEO is incompetent, but possibly what we can deduce from this example is that the CEO, the fitment to the current context of this organization, looking at his career motivators, may not be in place. And hence we are seeing for the last 2 years the business strategy, the business goal aiming at capturing market share. But really on the ground, this is not really what is happening. And it has taken 2 years or 3 years for this organization to realize and to come to an agreement and come to a consensus that what we need to do is to ensure that there is a better fitment of the CEO in this role. So that's why we're talking about assessments. And really, if we look at what we are really wanting to really summarize is that while assessments enable businesses with predictive data to fit the right person in the right role, what is really, really important is all these three elements of the right characteristics, the right fitment into the role, and the right fitment into culture. All these three elements need to come together very comprehensively for us to be able to predict success. Moving on, I just want to look at, what are the current trends that we are able to find in the market, which is also backed by research and backed by other data from other organizations. What I do want to also talk about at this point of time is that at InspireOne, when we look at the assessment offerings, we very much draw upon our relationship with IBM. And since IBM is an organization that really focuses on big data, predictability, research, a lot of what we talk about is really coming from that school of thought. Now, one of the things that is coming up very, very comprehensively is that especially in a VUCA environment, and we'll take the VUCA environment a little bit more in detail later, but what the CEOs need to do more and more today is to be able to measure and predict performance. And anything that helps them to do that, in this case what we're talking about is people performance, which is obviously very critical at that particular level, is really what the CEO is looking for. So this is becoming a greater need. Help me to predict performance is what most CEOs are saying. And in fact, if we look at other reports, for example, the Burson report, we are finding that the CEOs are having these kind of discussions more and more. And they're seeking people information, they're seeking people data so that they can align the business strategy with the people strategy. So this is becoming more and more of an increasing need. And what Simon Gluyas says from IBM is that the Asian market seems to be really picking up. So while about 3 years back it was the UK and the USA market, that was really looking at assessments in a very big way. Today, what the markets are demanding are, for more tools are also those markets that are based out of the eastern part of the world, the Asian markets in particular, whether we look at Hong Kong, China, Japan. And in this context, what we are also finding, even if we look at the Indian market, number of players are today offering tools, and number of assessment options are many, and these are available for people to use effectively. Later on, we will talk about the fact that how do we really pick and choose, but I think what would suffice at this point is to really be aware that this is a need that is really growing in this part of the region, and possibly because today we are looking at business metrics to really predict productivity and better performance. The VUCA environment, I mentioned this earlier. So the more the environment is turbulent, and we know that VUCA is really about volatile, uncertain, competitive, ambiguous environment, the greater the need to be able to predict and to be able to help that organizations, CEOs, leaders, everybody really needs more and more data. However, we will talk about this as well. It's not just data that will help us to predict, it's the right data and being able to make sense out of that data in an informed way that really helps to predict more effectively. So the VUCA effect is there and everybody's talking about it, so I don't need to really talk about this anymore except to say that the VUCA effect brings about the need to optimize. We have shorter time periods and a greater amount to optimize, and that's what the VUCA environment is doing to us today. When we look at the HR role, no more is the HR a support function, but really what the HR is doing today for businesses, the effective role of HR is to bring more evidence-based data and evidence-based decision making including things like behavioral economics and testing to all processes of HR and talent. So that's becoming a role which is becoming very, very critical, and I think as HR leaders we are required to be able to bring this data, bring this information into conversations which are strategic in nature. Organizations are looking at ways, so of course this is the part which is to do with customization. So while the shift has moved from standard to more customized solutions, again because every organization is at a different phase and you simply cannot just cut, copy, paste what A organization is doing and just build it into the strategy of B organizations. So to be able to define, measure and enable is really what is the reason for customization and the requirement for customization. This is becoming more and more the case. And what we are finding in the market is that when we work with customers, they invariably say, look at our context and look at your whatever you have and see how you can build this together. So it is really in partnership and through consulting that decisions are taken to be able to make sure that we are measuring the right things and we are also using the right kind of data to make an impact for the organization which is linked to business goals and business strategy. A quick example here, I know I talked about the organization which is new in its stage of evolution. Again, because it is a part of a large conglomerate, they realized very quickly that what was working for more evolved businesses within that conglomerate could not be simply applied in this new business that they were setting up. So the whole assessment strategy was different, the whole way that they were looking at development had to be different, and that's what we mean by organizations need to define, measure and enable their talent pipeline to meet their growth strategy. The other point over here is growth plans cannot be met by plans, by people competencies not matching up. And we are finding this gap is really growing. And in fact, if we look at yesterday's newspaper, and if I'm referring to all the national dailies, what they're talking about is that 60% of the organizations are finding that there is a talent gap. So while the growth strategy may be created, the opportunities are there in the market, there is a 60% gap in do we have the right talent to be able to really map or match up to that particular strategy. So that's something that is really becoming a wider gap. And finally, when we are looking at another trend, while I think about 5 years back and even 2 years back, a lot of personality tools were used to predict performance. Today, the trend is not just broad personality tools, not just occupational personality tools, but do we have tools, do we have predictability around especially leadership roles and leadership oriented personality tools. So these are available in the market, but that's the increasing trend. To move towards more specific tools that are measuring specifics that we need to look at to be able to achieve business goals. So largely these are the trends that we are finding in the market. What I also do want to talk about is for a minute that at IBM we feel extremely proud to say that in the last year we have administered tool to over 47 million candidates around the world. And when we do this kind of large-scale intervention globally, what we also then have access to is latest data. And this data then keeps getting used to make things more current, to make things more predictive, to make things more analytical. So that's the advantage of the scale at one level. And of course, most of us do know that there is a huge cost to wrong hire. I'm just going to very quickly quote a couple of CEOs and what they've said. So if we look at US, an example in the US, Zappos, Tony Shia talks about the fact that, he himself, that's his estimation, is that the company has spent over 100 million in wrong hires. That's a huge cost to the organization. What Harvard Business Review talks about is that 80% of employee turnover is due to wrong hires. If we look at more Indian-based data, what we also find is that 66% of employers say that they have experienced negative effect of bad hires, and almost 18% of them also say that it has a huge impact on both clients and on the internal climate of the organization, including sales. So there is a huge cost to wrong hires. And here what we can talk about from the IBM know-how is that 39% of these people who we have recently hired, if you ask the organizations, they'll say we would not have actually hired them. That means almost 40% of hires are wrong. And that, of course, has a huge impact. And from a actual rupee perspective, we can see what the turnover costs and the percentage cost of annual salary this costs. This is a report, of course, published by Forbes. So if I take an example here, and we take an example of a supervisor, what this really means is that if we've hired a wrong person, the cost of that is 100 to 150% of the cost of the supervisor himself or herself. Clearly, what this indicates is at the time of recruitment, talent intake, it is really important to have the right kind of person hired for the right kind of role. Now, what it also means is that the higher the person we are looking at, so when I'm saying higher, I'm meaning in terms of hierarchy. So when we are looking at leadership role, this percentage only goes up, because the impact that the leader has is not only on his role but also on a number of people that the person leads. So it's very critical that we make sure we are hiring now with more accurate predictive data, which is tested, which is tried, and which is something that we can be more sure of. And clearly what we are saying is that the earlier way of hiring, which was just interviewing or which was also reference checking, is not good enough. The impact also flows in terms of, and this is a slide which really talks about, so here it's not just a wrong person that we take in, but a wrong person that is placed in any role. So here what we are saying is that 41% of placing a wrong person in the role is lost worker productivity and so on. So negative impact on client solutions is as high as 22%. And clearly we would agree that this is not something that we can afford as leaders in HR. I would also like to look at what are the right kind of matrix that, let's say, hiring managers need to look at today. And one of the matrix that, we've come across from the IBM research is really that are we looking at not just the performance but also the potential of this person to be able to perform in this role and in the next role. And the minute we add that as a matrix to the current way that we take in talent or we use talent in existing roles, we find that this efficacy of this goes up by 18%. So what we're not looking at anymore in progressive organizations is how fast have we filled in a particular position, but also the effectiveness of the person in the role for the current position as well as the potential of this person. Now, of course, how do we really measure that? How do we really account for that is another subject, but we need to make our matrix more sharper. We need to make our matrix more progressive is the point that I would like to make through this particular slide. Moving on, so this is the cost, this is why it's really critical, this is why it's really important. So if this is the case, how do we really go about assessing, and what is it that we really need to bear in mind when we are looking at assessments? And here, therefore, what we're talking about is what is the philosophy to follow. And I would like to urge all of us as we go through the next few slides is to bear in mind that the key factor here is why are we assessing. So are we assessing for general intake? Of course, we don't need to go into anything which is very complex for that. Are we assessing for a critical leadership position? Then we need to bear in mind that there's a lot more data we need to have before we take a final call. Are we looking at high potentials? That's another area that we need to bear in mind. Again, has a huge bearing on how the organization is going to perform, and so on. Do we have the business goals clearly defined, and are we linking our assessments to business goals? So keeping all these factors in mind, and we'll delve into this a little bit more, I'd like to really just talk about one thing, that we will obviously get data from the assessments that we conduct, but how are we going to use this data and use it as information not only for that one-time activity but more as a process which we can use when we look at all aspects of HR become very, very important. Now, the model that we use at IBM is a very holistic model that takes into account the capacity. Now, this is the potential piece. So when we say capacity, it's not current capacity, but the capacity when we are looking at predicting for future as well. The capability. So the capability here is the behavior that the person has developed, the knowledge and skills, the experience that the person has, and through the experience, the skills that the person has built. And at the center of all of this is the culture fit. Extremely critical. You may get a very talented person who's worked very effectively in large organizations, but put that same person in a small organization which has a completely different dynamics and a completely different culture, and you will find that you've done the company and the individual a disservice. So the culture fit becomes a very critical component which is right at the center of it. But looking at capacity and capability and combining the information from both is what we really look at when we look at more complex hiring or more complex leadership development. I'll just spend a minute on this. So when we talk about capacity, we're talking about something which is more inherent, something which is more hardwired, if I was to use this term. So it's the preference of a person, it is the style of a person, it is the desired motivator of a person which is more intrinsic to that person. And like the example that I had taken of this earlier CEO, again the preference and the motivator was not what was matching. The capability was extremely high, but since the internal driver was not matching the current requirement of the role, we found that the organization had taken over 2 years or even longer to really come to a decision that the CEO is right, but the fitment is wrong. So hence it's really important to understand that. I often find, at least in my experience, a lot of organizations focus on looking at measuring competencies because the competency frameworks are there. You measure behaviors through multiple tools, whether these are multi-raters 360 or these are assessment or development centers or these are other methods in which we measure the behaviors. But when we don't measure the capacity and we don't measure the linkage between the capacity and the behavior and we don't make decisions based on this combination, then often we are not fully leveraging the capability and the capacity towards leadership development, and we'll take examples of that later. At this point, I just want to bring about the fact that it is important to look at both aspects. I think if you're looking at generic recruitment, which is mass recruitment, which is recruitment for roles for which people are broadly available, broadly the roles are very skill-based, we don't have to look at so many complex elements, but definitely when we are going into leadership, because here the webinar is focusing on understanding leaders better, then we have to really look at a match between all of these. So here what we're really talking about, and this is something that I think I've talked about, so I'll summarize more quickly, is that the starting point is the organization needs. What is the need of the organization? What is the current requirement of the organization? What is the next 3-year requirement of the organization based on the strategy of the organization? What are the drivers and culture that will help us achieve the organization strategy? Having a complete clarity around that. Then looking at a myriad of tools that are available in the market, whether these are tools which are self-assessment tools, or these are tools which are based on assessment by others, and looking at a number of technology tools which are now available. So looking at all the tools that are available in the market and making a good link between what is it that we want to measure and which tool will help us to measure which is the stage of evolution that we are at. So I just want to also just combine these 3 factors, which is the organization need, the number of tools that are, and the number of options that we have in the market, and the implications of using this particular tool or the right kind of tool. So take an example of this. This was a company which was, I would say, not in its earlier stages of inception, but possibly a more mature organization, but was also embarking into using assessments for the first time. They felt that what was most critical for them was to they narrowed down on this multi-rater as a good tool, a 360-degree tool for leaders to develop themselves, because they believed that the leaders needed a lot of data to be able to understand their strengths and understand how they're coming across to others, and then be able to really use this data to create development plans. And they narrowed down on a multi-rater. However, they had never used assessments before. And what they realized was, through discussions, that to be able to ensure that the assessment data will throw up the right kind of information, they really needed to sensitize their leaders. So what was very important was, so they clearly knew what was the business objective, but did the leaders also really understand what was the business objectives? Did they understand and were they sensitized to really accepting the 360-degree tool? Because often that's a big gap and that's a big issue. Was the organization and were the people ready to look at getting this information from the right kind of stakeholders? Now you can use a 360-degree tool, but if you don't have the input coming in which is right, again the data that it throws up will be skewed. So if I, for example, want information on myself, do I feel comfortable getting it from somebody who's critical of me rather than getting it from somebody who's my friend? And I know that I will get data which is something which is very comfortable for me. So sensitizing people on all of this, building this readiness within the organization, developing the skills of people to be able to give the right kind of data was absolutely important given the maturity curve in which this organization placed itself. So again, it's a lot of back-end work that needs to be done to be able to use assessments properly and to be able to draw the right kind of information from the data so it can be used very effectively. So this is important, this is very critical and back-end work that is required. And therefore what I just want to also conclude is that of course good leaders are born, but great leaders are created, are made. We talked about the capability and the capacity model earlier. The capability that can be built is as much as 70%. So leaders are not just born, 70% they need to be created. And in all organizations today where we are saying that the gap is huge, today the role of HR has become how do we shorten the 70%, how do we use the 70% to shorten this gap. So that's really what is really important. And when we talk about the IBM tools, and these are not the only tools that are available, what I just want to quickly bring up is that the tools that are created based on over 25,000 profiles that have been studied in a VUCA environment. So this is ongoing. We've come up with leadership assessment tools on the nature aspect, which is the capacity aspect, as well as the capability aspect. And we use both the tools, technology, and consulting to come up with the right strategy. So the consulting piece is equally important. The technology piece is in place because obviously IBM spends a lot of money on this, and the tools piece also needs to be in place. So combining the three is really helps us to come up with customized solutions which help to look at all the three aspects of defining what is it we want to measure, measuring what is it that we want to measure, and having an enabling approach so that we are able to then really look at data and information and look at how do we create the right kind of decisions. I just want to really look at the technology solutions, and this is something that is one of the latest things that has really come up. So IBM Watson, as most of you would know, is a system which IBM has spent trillions and billions of dollars into. This is basically looking at how does machine learning really help us to come up with decisions which are very, very good. And what I do want to talk about a minute in this is 80% of the data that is created in today's context is unstructured. This is voice data, this is text commentary data, and what IBM Watson is really doing is using this data to give very predictive results. And what is happening through Supernova powered by Watson is the opportunity for leaders to look at evidence-based data, so data that they can really feed into the system, and system that throws up what is it, gives them feedback on what are the behaviors that they are using, what is their sentiment that their behaviors is really being understood, and therefore what is the effectiveness of their behavior in their day-to-day work. This is something which is really looking at predicting future leaders' behaviors using a combination of behavioral science, cognitive computing, and data science. And this is something that is available today, which we offer for leadership development. So essentially what this means is that there are two ways in which people can use this particular application. One is that IBM Watson gives situations, and we can customize these situations, and people answer or give their views on these different situations, and they are given feedback on which behaviors do they demonstrate, what is the sentiment that they demonstrate, and therefore what is the way that they can predict their behaviors to create performance or not. And the second is that data which is already existing. So let's say I generate data through emails or through a meeting. All this data can go into this machine, and again this machine throws up information on what behaviors have I used, what is the sentiment that my communication is creating, and therefore what is the likely result of this. So this is how technology is really taking over, and I think for leadership development all this can be something which is very useful, which can help people to get constant feedback on how they are really using behaviors and therefore develop a lot on their own. Now I'd like to also spend a few minutes on how we use the outcomes of assessment, because so far what we've talked about is generating data, but what we've also looked at is that's not enough. How do we make sensible decisions based on outcomes? Here is a quick snapshot of how, and I'll take the example a little later of another organization that really used this effectively to make decisions of their leaders. So these are different types of reports that get created. The first one is individual profiling. Here we are looking at A, B, C, D, E being different candidates, and we're looking at different types of behaviors really on the x-axis and color coding it to see that which are the behaviors which are weak, marked by red, and which are behaviors which are extremely strong, which is marked by green. And at a snapshot you can look at different people and how do they really stack up with vis-a-vis each other. So this is one report that gets created. The other one is now we're looking at behaviors, and one of the things that we do at IBM is also look at benchmarks. So you can see that the benchmark for this particular leadership level is at 11, and if we look at the benchmarks, what we are saying is there are two behaviors that this group is demonstrating above the benchmark level, but a lot of behaviors, for example empathy, continuous improvement, which are at the end of this spectrum, is way below the high performance behavior benchmark. And if these behaviors are very, very critical to the organization's strategy, you can now see how critical it is to develop these behaviors and becomes absolutely an urgent agenda for an organization to follow. The third one, which is really important and which we'll just get to in a minute, is really looking at leadership potential matrix. And this becomes very critical when we look at our leaders and how do we place them in relevant roles. Should they be really looking at technical leadership roles or more management leadership roles or leadership roles? And how is it that we can use this particular data to create a strong leadership pipeline? So I'm going to take an example. This is an example of a travel website, travel portal website company that we worked with. And here we're just taking examples of about 4 individuals and how we really looked at using this data to create strong decisions, predictive decisions. So on the x-axis we really have the capacity. So we call this the leadership orientation, the preference and the motivators of people. They were measured on this. And on the y-axis we have percentage the capability based on the percentage of behaviors that they demonstrated, and this is benchmarked to the level of leadership role. I know it sounds a little complex, but actually it's not so. Essentially we say for every leadership level, the benchmark changes. So obviously a first-time manager, the behaviors that they would require would be very different from, let's say, a CEO of a Unilever. And based on that, we have benchmarks. So the percentage benchmarks remains constant, but of course that percentage changes depending upon the level of the leadership role. And here what we did was we mapped, let's say, all their people that we had measured on this grid, and from that what we came to a conclusion on is to say that let's say sample individual 1 marked by the red dot is probably in the wrong role, and probably what we need to look at is how do we correct the role that this person is in, because neither does the person have the orientation nor has the person developed enough to be able to perform this particular role. And this was mid to senior level. So it was important to really identify that do we have the right role for this particular individual. That was the discussion we had for sample individual 1. Whereas if we look at the individual 2, sample individual 2 marked by a purple dot, what we can really clearly see is that the person has a strong orientation and pretty much vis-a-vis the benchmark is at about 90-92%. Now clearly this person can be given stretched assignment to be able to take them to the blue box which is ready to progress. Now if we can put this person in situations or give this person situations to develop these certain behaviors, which behaviors come from their individual assessments, clearly we can stretch this person and this person is ready to move into our leadership pipeline for the next role in about 6 to 12 months. We have the yellow dot now, where we are saying that the orientation is pretty high, but the behaviors haven't been developed. And clearly, again, we will look at the type of interventions that we need to provide this person, because the orientation being high, the development of behaviors should be possible, and so on. So I'm taking just 3 examples. So this really helps us in a very comprehensive way to take each person's profile and look at how is it that we can place this profile or this person, how can we give the right kind of leadership development options to this person so that we can fast track the development of this person, linked to who they are. So we are using their strengths, linked to where we want to go. Now, obviously, all this then dovetails into the kind of decisions and the kind of assessment strategy that we want to really create. And so I'll very quickly take you through this part because we want to keep 5-7 minutes at least for question and answers. The first thing is we want to really measure what matters. So generic measurement is out. We need to be really clear about what is the focus of the CEO, what is the focus of the measure, what is it that the CEO wants to really be able to predict, looking at a future on a daily basis, on a quarterly basis, on an annual basis. That is what we then dovetail into our assessment strategy. That is what we dovetail into the information that we feed in. And of course, what we are looking at from an HR perspective is the people part of it. The second thing is, which are those critical job families and which are those critical people in those job families that really create or make sense for the business strategy of the organization? Is it, for example, sales? Is it, for example, product development? Is it, for example, is the strategy, for example, based on acquisition of different companies? What is it really based on? And therefore, coming from that, what are the important competencies we need for that? Which are the important roles that help us really meet these particular business matrix most effectively? And which are the top resources within these roles, within these families that we really want to be able to measure, that we really want to be able to grow, which we really want to really be able to offer leadership opportunities to. So all this is really important at different levels, obviously, and for different decisions, we look at a combination of this. Then we really look at, so that's where our matrix really comes into play. Then we look at how do we create a base, because alone an HR cannot really ensure success. So we have to look at the readiness. We can't use the best tools in an organization that's not really ready for it. So how do we assess the readiness of the organizations and start building the business case, take the stakeholders into account? A very, very common mistake that we find in organizations is that this whole strategic piece is owned only by the HR people, sometimes only by the talent people, and the business people have no idea about it. So what they do and what they say on the ground is, well, you're measuring, you're measuring our people. There are development centers that you're holding. The development center results are not corresponding with what we observe on the ground. And a lot of deviation from this is occurring because there is no clear understanding of how to use this data, how to amalgamate the data of what they see as performance on the ground and what is the information and the input that we are getting from development centers and such like tools. And obviously, therefore, one is to select the right kind of tools, but the other important thing is really to build the skills within the organization so that you can align what you're doing best and what the people are being able to use effectively. So building partnerships, using data as an important source for all decision making, and being able to document your work and direct this towards business decisions and business objectives. And really here what we are saying is that, workforce analytics, which is becoming very, very important, doesn't really start with data, but it really starts with saying, where are you at? What are the business needs? How are you using this data to be able to bridge the two? So what is really the call for action, if we really look at it, is looking at partnerships, more partnerships with people from the business, what we're really saying here is that the leader of the analytics function does not need to be the best statistician, but really needs to develop skills in being able to build organization capability, not just with the HR, L&D, OD, but also with business, to be able to use the data that we are drawing from a number of tools, number of assessments, and to be able to link it to business strategy and to be able to use it for stronger decision making. So that's what we are really, wanting to say and wanting to really bring through this webinar. I would really like to use the next 10 minutes to answer your questions. And what I'd also like to say is that because there is a paucity of time, in case we are not able to answer all the questions that you have, we will definitely be getting back, of course with the deck, the slide deck that will be available to you, but also with the answers to questions that we are not able to address through this webinar. Let me start with the first question. Right, so the first question is really something that comes up and a lot of organizations ask us for this. How do we resolve the data discrepancy that comes up between the performance that we observe over here and any assessment data? And here a lot of times the discrepancy comes up between assessment data that development centers throw up. So I want to take a real life case to answer this question. We have actually a very, very senior business head bringing this up to us to say that, there is a policy decision taken by the organization that for our leadership levels, we are going to use development centers. And the development center data that has been thrown up, and this is not a development center that we have conducted, but somebody else has conducted. But really what they're saying is that the development center data is not something that the individual is buying into, neither is the business leader buying into. And this is an issue, this is a problem. So when we delve deeper into it, the talent people tell us from the past, they have always found that the DC data that is generated is very predictive. So over the years, they find that whatever the data that the DC report is throwing up, 3 years later, it becomes very clear that that data was absolutely right. But in the current context, there is a lack of buying. And so why is this the case? And possibly the gap is that we have not understood that there are two different data points we are looking at. The performance data that a manager or a leader looks at is the here and now data, is based on past performance, is based on the what, quite often not on the how. It is important to use that data, but that's not all it's not a complete picture. If you are looking at now, using any data to decide on the promotion of this particular leader, and we all know that past performance is not a prediction on whether the person is going to perform well in the new role. The DC data typically throws up information on putting this person at, let's say, a more senior or a more higher or a more complex role, and looking at how this person is going to perform in that particular role, and so may not correspond with the past performance data. But it's really the leader who has to understand why there is this discrepancy, understand this discrepancy, explain it to the person in discussion at this point of time, and use this, validate it by all means, but use this to be able to make more sensible decisions about whether this person should be placed in the current role with more responsibilities or be given a totally different role in which possibly the competencies that are required for the next role, there is a huge gap. So to me, it was when we discussed it with the people concerned, we all came to this conclusion that in this particular context, this is why there is a discrepancy. We understand, and we understood the business leaders' issues as well, because you cannot have a current performer being demotivated because the DC data is showing a different result. And that was the worry of the business leader, that if this person is demotivated, this person's performance is going to go down, and that's not what I want for today. So yes, we have to look at how do we use this, how do we use this understanding not to demotivate this person, how do we use this data to be able to help this person create a development plan which motivates this person. But we will not be doing good service to either this person or to the organization by saying that just because the person is performing well today, let's disregard the DC data that is coming up and place this person in a higher order role. So that's the conclusion we came to. So I think the answer to this question, the short answer to this question, is to understand what is the discrepancy about, is to understand what is the data that the different assessment processes are throwing up, and then be able to reconcile this, because this may be different for different situations. So that's my answer to question number 1. So a second question that has come up is, can we do benchmarking for an organization for a specific role? Absolutely. Absolutely the case. At IBM, when we look at talent frameworks, what we have is, and we've looked at it from a global perspective, and the global perspective obviously takes into account a lot of local data as well, that for specific roles, and when we talk about specific roles, here we are talking about also technical roles, we have benchmarks for specific organizations. So if we know that, let's say, let me take an example of an R&D manufacturing head, an R&D head in a manufacturing organization. So if we look at a manufacturing organization, what we would have therefore is that what is the benchmark for an R&D head, and therefore what are the things that this person needs to be able to do well for his role to be able to be performed. And that's the benchmark that we can look at, and then look at really in our organization, does this fit in, does this not fit in, from the benchmarks, what is it that is valid, what is not valid, and then look at really measuring, creating measures around what is really critical to us. So can we benchmark for an organization for a specific role? The answer is yes. How do we benchmark? There are benchmarks available not just with IBM, possibly with other organizations as well. So using those benchmarks so that we don't miss out anything which is absolutely critical, then saying out of the benchmarks what is critical to us, because everything may not be valid, but at least you have a comprehensive list to work on, and then saying for what is valid to us given the stage that we are in, given the strategy that we are following at this point of time, and then working forward from there to say that what do we need this for, and then making this alignment possible. There is a third question that we will take up as well. Is it possible to map an organization's competency framework to assessments? So here my answer is, not only is it possible, it is absolutely critical to map an organization's competency frameworks to assessments. However, there's one caveat, and the caveat is the competency framework firstly mapped to the organization's strategy? In today's context, competency frameworks are being revised every 4 to 5 years. Because we are operating in a VUCA environment, the competency framework needs to link to the business strategy. And if the business strategy changes every 3 to 5 years, we can't have an outdated competency framework that was created 10-15 years back. So the step-by-step process really here is, you have to be, as business leaders, as HR business leaders, we need to be aligned to business. So if we understand what is the strategy of the organization, we understand for that strategy to work well, what are the competencies which are very critical. We then say for leadership roles at different levels, which competencies are most important and at what proficiency levels are these absolutely critical. This is what has to be done back end. Once we know the proficiency levels for these different leadership roles, then of course it is absolutely important to assess people, whether for recruitment, whether for development, linked to these proficiency levels, which are then linked back to the strategy of the organization. So that's the way it flows. And what I would absolutely like to insist upon is there's no point having a competency framework which is not linked to the different processes of the HR, whether it is assessment, whether it is talent development, whether it is leadership development. It necessarily must be linked. But if you're just assessing something and the basis of it is not correct, then we have another issue also, because then you're taking in people and your assessments are perfect, but again it's not linked to the strategy and to the requirement. So one, of course, it must be linked. Second, this whole process must be aligned. So when this happens, then of course you have very, very good and predictive data to ensure that you're speeding up people's performance, you're ensuring that the performance is linked to a business strategy and goal, you're contributing in a very strategic way to ensure that while there is a strategy of the organization at one end, the people strategy is totally linked and aligned to it. And you're making sure that you're bringing in all this data and information in all, whether these are weekly meetings, these are quarterly meetings, these are strategic meetings, in every meeting. So there is a last question that I'll take. Should an ideal assessment give a recommendation at the end? Usually we see that most assessments just provide strengths and weaknesses to the organization and compare results of individuals and identify the one who fits the role the best. Yes, I certainly feel so, and that's why I feel that there are three aspects to it. There is a consulting aspect, there is an assessment tool aspect of it, and both these need to come together. So what I mean by that is, the clearer we are about the objective that we are trying to achieve through using the assessment tool, the clearer we are about the recommendations that we are making. So for example, if we have just used assessment simply to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the person, this is just being used to create a generic individual development plan, then that's what that's the kind of report that you should ask for. But if you're using assessments for more strategic objectives, then of course this should be defined in the beginning. The assessment partner should be a partner to this, should be able to map what is it that you're wanting to measure to what the tool is measuring and how this is going to come together. And as a company or an organization that's wanting recommendations, I would urge you to ask for that so that you get that kind of recommendation which is important for you to be able to make the right kind of decisions. So I'm afraid that we've run out of time. There are more questions that are there. And I'm really sorry that we've not been able to take it up within the assigned time. But definitely we would be getting back to you, and we would be happy to answer any other questions, take up anything else that you would want us to take up. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that this has been useful to you, and while it's been a one-way conversation, I have personally enjoyed this webinar very much myself. So thank you very much for your presence.